Jim Legette joins us this morning. He is a lecturer of economics at Mississippi State. He has studied the economics of the United States and the world for a long time, and a semi-regular guest on SuperTalk Mississippi. Jim, I feel like I should start by saying thanks for your patience. I know we've been trying to get this scheduled for a while, and between our schedules and your schedules, it's been hard to do, but it's great to have you on and to visit with you this morning.
We finally made it work. And in fact, about 2 weeks ago, I guess before Paul passed, Alex and I thought we'd had it figured out. Then I made the mistake of looking at my calendar and go, oops, that's why you're supposed to look at your calendar before you agree to something. So I did, okay, it's my turn to be private staffer and screw this one up.
There you go. It's the whole ready, fire, aim versus ready, aim, fire phenomenon that we deal with sometimes. Let's jump right in. There's a lot to talk about with where we are economically in the United States. Let's start with the most recent news from earlier this week. The AI market was kind of turned on its head. Massive valuation drop for NVIDIA, some $500 billion, but that's they've still got plenty of money. There's still a lot of market cap for NVIDIA. If you can explain to us in the most a fifth grader could understand it terms, the AI market globally, what's going on and how big of an impact does that have economically going forward?
Okay, you said what's going on and how big of an impact?
Yes, sir.
Okay, to me, artificial intelligence, AI, whatever you want to call it, I think, as a general statement, has the potential to be one of the most revolutionary changes in technology, maybe even surpassing what the internet did. And I think there was an assumption that we the U.S. would be the dominance in tech. And what we now know with the pace of innovation, China said, wait a minute, we know how to do tech too. So that probably rattled everybody's foundation. Now, I think what's going to really happen is, as you know, when you bring a competitor in there, it makes everybody work harder, better, and faster.
Certainly does that, and there were people that were singing doom and gloom about the stock market earlier this week when some of this AI news broke, and I was reminded of that quote that is so often misquoted, rumors of my demise greatly exaggerated, as we see the Dow still sitting at 44,000 in that record high range. Is this a blip on the radar?
Value to begin with. You think about the AI companies. It's kind of almost a gold rush mentality. And we know somebody's going to make a pot full of money and somebody's going to lose their proverbial backside. Usually whoever I invest in is the one that works. I still am confident in it. I think the spur from the Chinese will be good because I'm sure there were some panic meetings at Silicon Valley. And the Chinese, and whether the Chinese company has the advantages, they're the second mover. In other words, they can look what everybody else did and put their own spin on it. And there's some advantage in that.
Visiting with Jim Legette, he is a lecturer of economics at Mississippi State. What about the interest rate market? It's not always the same thing, right? The Fed rate is not necessarily the same thing as mortgage rates that become, things that hit a little closer to home. Let's start with the Fed. Donald Trump, the new president, has said he thinks that rates need to come down. He and the chair of the Federal Reserve, not necessarily on exactly the same page. How does this play out?
Well, I think, that's a couple points. You talked about the federal funds rate, which is what the Fed worries about. It's kind of like the wholesale rates, and everything else follows it. If all of a sudden everybody wants to go buy houses, mortgages are going up. I think it's probably disappointing as it was to the president. The Fed is doing the right thing, staying the course, because we really still haven't wrung out inflation. And what we've learned is, one, the Fed probably caused it far more than Joe Biden or Trump put them all together. And to get rid of inflation is a slow and painful process, and we are an impatient species, and we want it yesterday. And what the delicate balancing act the Fed has to is they have to go do what they think is, quote, the right thing. And what we've seen, not only in our country, but the rest of the world, if the Fed becomes, quote, too political, you get inflation. In the U.S., it was Arthur Burns and at the Fed in the early 70s, and you may or may not have been you probably were in diapers at that time, and I was just starting economics classes. That's when we learned about inflation again, and some of those folks out there probably remember 20% mortgages, and they thought that was a good deal. So I suspect at some point Powell will become, and Trump will butt heads. I think he's doing the right thing, but it's probably going to get a little antsy for him at some point.
The Federal Reserve, because of its name, I think there are a lot of people that are under the impression that that is part of the government and not a separate entity. It is not. We
That's
get
correct.
At least the impression that Donald Trump would like somebody other than Jerome Powell to be running the Federal Reserve. Powell has said in no uncertain terms, I'm not going anywhere, and there's nothing the president can do about it. You say it's likely that they will butt heads. When they butt heads, who's got the harder noggin?
Well, that's the interesting test. Because the way the Fed is structured, as you properly pointed out, it's not a government entity, but the president and Congress control it, and it's set that way on purpose so you'll be immune to political pressure. You can argue what's the right thing or wrong. So it will be a test of wills. All I know is I certainly wouldn't want to have I can't call it a Twitter mob anymore, but Trump's Twitter feed going against Powell. But when the Fed has been successful. I'm thinking about in the 80s for Paul Volcker. Then President Reagan said, well, I know fighting inflation's a nasty job. It's going to be ugly. I'm going to give you air cover.
Mm.
And people who, in fact, Powell, one of his heroes is Paul Volcker. And Reagan gave him air cover, and it was ugly. I can remember literally as a young a graduate student going to a conference in D.C., get off the metro there, and then it had cleaning it up for your audience, had a subway graffiti that said Paul Volcker stinks. Only in D.C., right?
Yeah. I guess only in D.C. Yeah. Well, what about mortgage rates, Jim? Because this is something that hits home a whole lot closer for a lot of people than the Fed rate, which you described as the wholesale rate.
Yeah.
30-year fixed rates at about 7% right now.
Yeah.
Jumbo prices are up as well. I was speaking with somebody last night in the mortgage industry that said, yeah, probably the summer before they come down. This is just the environment we're in, but it's a hard environment to swallow. You brought the historical perspective to this from the early 80s. We're coming out of a decade or so of historically low mortgage rates. This is an uncomfortable time for a lot of borrowers for home. Is there relief in sight in your mind?
I think it will, but it won't be. It probably be whoever you're talking to. My wife's a real estate broker, so I know a lot about the other side of this equation.
Right.
People buy stuff in the spring and summer, so you got demand driving it. Now, one of the things that's interesting, I live in Starkville. We live in a nice neighborhood. Literally, within the last month or two, 3 new houses have started. And these are relatively high-end homes, and I would imagine the builder, one's a spec house and one's somebody bought. Wait a minute, 0.75% on a big mortgage, that's serious money. So they were kind of sitting on the sidelines. And I think to the point, we got used to abnormally low rates and thought that was the norm. And now we're kind of back to where it's supposed to be. And then what it's done, kind of distortion, is that's why people like, I'm not a leader at, but a lot of folks rail against malinvestment occurs with too low of interest rates. It motivated people to buy bigger houses. It motivated people to build bigger houses. Then it got more expensive to buy them. There's plenty of homes at the high end, but if you're in that middle range for starter or second pop at it, you're priced out of the market.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The people that are looking for that house that is between $200,000 and $500,000, and now I live in Oxford. You talk about living in Starkville. I understand that I'm in a bit of a real estate bubble, but it's an almost impossibility to find that type house.
That's right. And what I've observed watching my wife talk about her business is, the high end, you got money, you can go play. If you're that person who saved their money, you better go buy whatever you got because it will disappear immediately.
Yeah.
And then other dynamic is, and once again, interest rates are far more important than just what you pay. Is it froze? Say you've been in the starter home for a while, and you're ready to move up. Well, you can't because you can't afford it, and therefore the next group that's coming through, there's nothing for them to go buy.
Yeah.
So that's why the fancy economic word is malinvestments.
Jim, you got time to hang with us for just a couple more minutes?
Of course.
All right, we're going to take a time out.
Coffee, so
There you go. That's a good plan. More of the Gallo Show coming up right after this on SuperTalk Mississippi. Gallo Radio Show, SuperTalk Mississippi. Thanks for being with us on this Thursday morning. Continuing our conversation with Jim Legette. He is a lecturer of economics at Mississippi State. Kind enough to spend a few more minutes with us. Jim, with Donald Trump 8 days into his presidency, you had media members and I guess Democrats in general saying, well, President Trump campaigned on lowering prices and eggs are higher than they've ever been. I can't decide if this is just politically motivated or if people are actually that dumb.
Sometimes you wonder. If you've ever watched that movie Idiocracy, you got to watch it.
Okay.
It's about a world that's become dumbed down. It's Saturday Night Live characters, and they're like putting Gatorade on plants, and it's dying. And some guy says, just put water on. But anyway, I think it's part politically motivated, and part people don't understand how economics works. And you were talking about eggs. Well, there's something bigger than the president here. If there's bird flu killing the chickens, there's not going to be as many eggs around. And no president can fix that one. That doesn't mean you're not going to get beat up about it.
And it's not just bird flu, right? I mean, J.D. Vance, in response to a question about that, said, well, look, yes, we did campaign on lowering prices across the board, but it's a process because energy prices are high, and that means fuel prices are high, and so shipping costs are high, and you've got this bird flu thing going on. It's going to take a little bit of time. What is that time window? What is a reasonable amount of time to get to a point where, and I've often said, like, hey, if you think prices are going back to where they were, forget about it. It's more about stabilizing. When do we stabilize?
You raise a good point. It's all about stabilizing. We talked about the 80s earlier. We didn't go back to 1965 prices.
Yeah.
But the disrupting effect of inflation, maybe insidious is even a better word, is you can't predict things. You can't plan. And the scholarship suggests any change in, say, Federal Reserve policy takes 6 to 18 months, give or take. But here's something more subtle. It's if you believe there's going to be inflation, it's going to be baked into your plans. And so the really tough part is you have to break that psychology. And what was interesting about the 80s, people quickly recognized that Paul Volcker meant it and President Reagan meant it, and then all of a sudden inflation came down like a rock in 83, 84. Folks may remember the morning in America campaign. So I think one reason that Trump has been, use the blitzkrieg strategy because there is an element of that, is, wait a minute, this dude's doing what he said he was going to do. And whether or not you like the particular policy or not, the fact you're doing what you said you did establishes credibility and said, okay, you're going to do something about inflation. Maybe I don't need to bake that into my the fancy word is called inflationary expectations. And if my students are out there listening, you'll learn about that in April. But it takes a while.
Coming in April, you've got to wait a little while longer for that lesson. When you look at the market right now, whether you're talking about the Dow or the NASDAQ or the S&P 500, do you believe that the fundamentals of the market right now are solid, or is this like a house of cards?
Well, I think markets are always more fragile than we want to think they are. If you have some external event, it always knocks it off. There's stuff you don't think about, wars, pandemics, stuff like that. I think, cycling back to our discussion about AI, I think there's a rosy scenario baked into that that suggests that it's going to be okay over time. Now, the black cloud on the horizon is, this debt's problematic. In the 90s, they had a term called the bond vigilantes. And when the financial markets say, you can't continue to borrow without impunity, that's going to be a far more, constraint on government from any party. I remember, I think it was during the Clinton years, it was James Carville, and probably had some colorful thing. So next time I want to come back as something more powerful, a bond trader, because now you can do whatever you want to.
Mm.
And I've read some things in the Wall Street Journal talks about the bond vigilantes. And, our debtors don't like inflation, and they don't like us having big debt. And they're going to be the ones that make us do something, put it on a personal level. Your bank will loan you money till that day they decide they don't want to loan you money. And then now you're the one with you're both the one with the problem. So, that black cloud is out there on the horizon. And so I think that's why markets, I think, are hopeful that the Elon Musk project is successful. I think it's going to be extraordinarily challenging because one man's waste, fraud, and abuse is another guy's income. And you got to focus, you got to pound, and you got to get Congress to do stuff. And they're not going to like this. Nobody likes cutting stuff because that means they get yelled at.
Yeah.
But it's necessary, I think.
I'm sure you've heard people say before, like as an individual borrower, not an institutional borrower, but as an individual, if you've got a little bit of debt with the bank, you got something to be worried about. If you got a lot of debt, you got nothing to worry about.
Because their face tied to you.
So, well, and I guess the larger question that I'm getting to, does that apply for the national debt? I mean, we're north of $36 trillion. It's a number that gets thrown around, but I don't think most of us have the ability to grasp just how much money that is and how much of our budget is going just to paying interest on that. Is it the same principle, though, that, there really isn't a default because the number is so big?
Yeah. Well, I think, to the point you're raising, roughly speaking, half of U.S. debt is owned by non-U.S. entities. That's a fancy way of saying foreigners. Mm-hmm. And it's Japan, around 10%, China, 10 to 15%, and the Brits of all things, and then the rest of the world. And let's say I'm a big Chinese bank and I'm heavily invested in U.S. debt. Well, one, I don't want you people to have inflation because that means when you pay me back, I get the short end of the stick. But I also don't want you guys to go under because I really can't afford to lose, say, 10% of what you use $36 trillion. Most entities can't afford to lose $3 to $4 trillion.
Right.
When you think back to the financial crises, when all the, as the Brits say, all those dodgy loans and subprime went south, and then you found people like Wachovia, I forget who the other ones were, Countrywide, Citicorp was at the verge, and now they had to be saved because if you start losing banks, the rest of us go down. That's the learning from the Great Depression. Ponder this: 10,000 banks failed in that. Ponder, if you had some money in the bank, you might have gotten wiped out in the afternoon, and there was no FDIC.
Yeah.
So the banks went down too. So hopefully we don't have to learn that. We learned that lesson, but as Mark Twain said, one of my favorite quotes is, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Yeah,
which is more subtle, and you can find it. And I think the other thing happens is that the people who understood what happened in the 30s aren't with us anymore. And it was in World War II, so they're not going to be able to help them.
Is there a scenario where we get this national debt under control? Because, I mean, Republicans like to say, spend less, be fiscally conservative, and yet they spend like drunken sailors. And Democrats don't even pretend they spend like drunken sailors. Is anybody going to actually rein it in? And does it matter with the size of that number?
Well, I think realistically, what can happen? Let's back off. And when you take 60% of it off the table, Social Security and Medicare, just as a math exercise, you can't make it work. Paul Ryan when he speaks said, "Hey, it's math." That doesn't mean we like math. I think a realistic, we're not going to whack that down to, by half in any president's term. But if you kind of flatten out the growth and you get the economy growing, you can kind of grow your way out of it. I think that's the only hope, because all heck would break loose if somebody seriously advocated cutting Social Security and Medicare by anything. I mean, if you talk about it, they run you out immediately. Was it Moynihan called it third rail politics?
Hey, and it doesn't matter if it's at the national level or you start talking about PERS at the state level. I mean, you want to get people with torches and pitchforks. That's the fastest way to do it.
So that's why I say, politically the most practical way is somehow get this great engine called the American economy singing, and maybe that's why AI is so darn important. But at the same time, just because you have more money coming in doesn't mean you get to spend it on pet projects. You got to pay down that credit card.
There you go. Jim, always appreciate the time. Your insights are fascinating, and good visiting with you this morning. Glad we finally got it done.
That's right, and maybe next time it'll be easier. In fact, even our video feed didn't work right. So, well, of course.
That's right. Got to knock the cobwebs out of that. Jim Legette, lecturer of economics at Mississippi State. Always a fun conversation. Quick time out. We got more with you on the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk Mississippi. We are back right after this.